Shalom and welcome for another episode of The Case for Messiah, an Old Testament defense of the New Testament faith. My name is Seth Postel. I'm here with Dr. Golan Broshi, and today is an episode you don't want to miss. We're going to be looking at a very famous passage, Isaiah chapter 9, with the question, is this just history or is this a messianic prophecy? So Golan, we have a great episode today.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Well, before we even start, what's the Christian assumptions? What's the messianic assumptions concerning this chapter?
Well, you know, this is a passage that's cited very often. In fact, oftentimes it's a verse that's used even in the celebration, say, of Christmas, right? Mm-hmm. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. Now, just before we actually jump in, it's important to notice that in the Hebrew, it's verses 5 and 6 of chapter 9.
Yes.
In the English, verses 6 and 7. I suspect throughout the podcast, we may sometimes get confused with the verses, but just so we know that the verses are one off between the Hebrew and the English.
Yeah. So we think that this passage talks about a divine Messiah and a Messiah that is going to fulfill what is spoken about in verse 7 in the English.
Okay. So basically, yes. In other words, the Christian assumption, you know, the New Testament assumption is that this passage is about a divine Messiah and that Jesus is this child who was born who will fulfill verse 6 or verse 7
in the English
in the future. In other words, one day Jesus will sit forever on the throne of David and rule and reign. Okay, so there's an aspect of this passage that has been fulfilled and an aspect of this passage that has not yet been fulfilled. And that is the Christian assumption.
Yep. So we have at least 4 main objections to this interpretation. And the first one is that all the verbs, at least in verse 6 in the English, all the verbs are in the past tense.
Which means
that it has been fulfilled already in the days of Isaiah.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
So that's the first objection. The verbs are in the past tense. Mm-hmm. The second is that the divine names belong to God, not to the child. So why do you say that Yeshua fulfilled the names? Why do you say the names are about Yeshua if the names are obviously or clearly about God himself? Now, the third one that we're going to tackle is that the passage refers anyway to Chizkiah, in English, Hezekiah, and not to the Messiah. So what's the big deal anyway? And the last one is, what do you do with the fact that the New Testament never quotes these verses specifically?
Correct.
Or right? Well,
yes.
The New Testament doesn't quote it. So why do you say it's a messianic prophecy?
Or why would we say it's about Jesus if the New Testament never says it's about Jesus?
So let's start with objection number 1. Make it really simple. All the verbs are in the past tense.
Okay.
So what's the big deal?
Yes. So basically, those who try to refute the Christian interpretation of this passage, they would argue that the New Testament, the English translations of this passage are completely wrong. Not only they're wrong, they're deceptive, they're misleading, right? So in the Christian translation, for instance, New American Standard, for a child will be born to us. You know, a son will be given to us. The government will rest upon his shoulders. His name will be called, right? So basically, this whole notion that this is in the future, the problem is anybody who can read the Hebrew would understand that all these verbs are in the past tense. So it doesn't say a child will be born to us. It says a child has been born to us. A son has been given to us. The authority has settled on his shoulders. He has been named, right? And so the thought that this passage is a future prophecy is just simply a misreading of the actual Hebrew text. That's the objection.
So what's our response to that argument?
So the bottom line is that the argument, one well-known apologist basically argues all the verbs are in the perfect tense, the past tense, okay? But the argument actually treats biblical Hebrew as if it's Latin or Greek. In other words, it's an interpretation that actually is not reading biblical Hebrew and treating biblical Hebrew on its own terms.
Exactly. And we have a quote by a scholar.
Yeah, so John H. Sailhammer, he basically argues, and correctly, that the whole notion of talking about perfect verbs in biblical Hebrew or imperfect verbs in biblical Hebrew is just simply forcing Latin categories on ancient Near Eastern texts. So this is his quote. "It is now widely recognized that biblical Hebrew cannot or should not be pressed into the linguistic mold of Greek and Latin. As any other human language, Hebrew has its own distinct grammar and syntax." And so the whole notion that you can refute the messianic interpretation of this verse because all the verbs are in the perfect is actually kind of a demonstration that it's actually an argument that's not rooted in biblical Hebrew at all. It claims to be reading the biblical Hebrew, but it's using Latin and Greek categories that don't exist in biblical Hebrew.
Yeah.
But even if, let's assume. That these Latin categories exist. In other words, let's just assume that you have a certain form of the Hebrew verb that always refers to the past tense, or a certain form of the verb that always refers to the future. It's really interesting. We can actually see in biblical Hebrew, these so-called perfect verbs are often used in biblical Hebrew to refer to the future as well. For instance, perfect verbs in promises. God says, right, in Genesis 17:20, "Look, I will bless him." The verb there, berachti.
It sounds like in the past.
It sounds like in the past, but the verb has nothing to do with the tense. And in this context, it refers to something future.
So actually, in the Tanakh, in poetry and in prophecy literature, it's quite common that the verb looks like the past but refers to the future.
Correct. Also, so-called perfect verbs. And again, I'm using this for argument's sake. I don't believe there's such a thing as a perfect verb in biblical Hebrew. But if you want to say a perfect verb or a perfect form of the verb, in prophecies, many times the translation is future. So for instance, in Isaiah 5:13, "Assuredly my people will suffer exile." Gala. That's a perfect tense, right? "For the land shall be filled." Isaiah 11:9. The land shall be filled with the devotion of the Lord. Malah. So to argue that based on these forms that Isaiah 9 is in the past tense and already fulfilled, it
doesn't hold water.
No. And then even in this passage, we have what's called imperfect consecutive verbs, okay, that are typically translated as past tense. But we have these same forms. Psalm 49:15, "The upright shall rule over them at daybreak." That's what's called an imperfect consecutive that refers to a future action. Isaiah 5:15, "And man shall be humbled, and man shall be brought low." These are perfect or imperfect consecutives once again that refer to the future.
So in the bottom line, even if for modern Hebrew person like me that reads the Hebrew, even though it sounds like the past tense, obviously the passage himself obviously talks about the future.
Correct.
Even though the use sounds like a past tense verb.
So basically, linguists of biblical Hebrew basically show, and they've argued, that these so-called, like in modern Hebrew, we have a tense that is always used for past. We have a tense that's always used for future. But in biblical Hebrew, the same so-called form or tense can refer to past, present, and future.
Exactly. But more than that, moreover.
So let's just assume for a moment that there are specific forms that are tied to specific times, okay? So here's what's really interesting. I want you to let's look at Isaiah 9, verses 5 and 6 again.
And it's 6 and 7 in English, right?
Correct. Yeah. "For a child has been born to us." Okay, correct. Okay, past tense, the past form.
It looks like past tense.
Okay. "A son has been given to us." Okay, fine. Past tense form. "An authority has settled on his shoulders." Okay, past tense form. "And he has been named Vayikra. The mighty God is planning grace." And by the way, I'm actually using the JPS translation.
A Jewish
translation. So let's keep going. "The mighty God is planning grace, the eternal Father, a peaceable ruler." Now, I don't agree with the translation, but let's keep going. in token of abundant authority and of peace without limit upon David's throne and kingdom, that it may be firmly established in justice and in equity now and evermore. Now notice it says, the zeal of the Lord of hosts shall bring this to pass. Well, guess what? The verb here, ta'aseh, even our rabbinic apologists that are trying to say that everything here is in the past tense would look at this verb and say, okay, this verb clearly is referring to a future time. And it's by virtue of the fact that this future verb is used, it means that all of this passage has yet to be accomplished and God will do it sometime in the future.
So Isaiah himself understood it as something that will be done by God in the future.
Correct. So to argue that all the verbs here are past tense is just it's a shallow reading of biblical Hebrew.
And even if it was?
And even if it was true, then what do you do with verse 7 in the English, where it clearly articulates that the things that it has said so far, God will do in the future.
Okay, so that was objection number 1. Objection 2, all the divine names belong to God, not to the child. So what's the big deal with mighty God? And it all belongs to God anyway.
Again, the argument is that the biblical Hebrew, or the Hebrew of the Christians, or the English translations of the Hebrew, once again, very, very misleading.
How did they translate it?
Okay, so the English translations say, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. However, the Chabad translation of the English has a very different reading.
What do they say?
Notice what it says. For a child has been born to us, a son given to us, and the authority is upon his shoulder, and the wondrous advisor, Peleuetz, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, called his name the Prince of Peace. In other words, all three of the names, the first three names, they're the subject of the verb.
Exactly. And belong to God,
and they belong to God, who calls the child Prince of Peace. And so the argument here is that the English translations have completely mistranslated the Hebrew.
And you're saying that Chabad actually have a case.
Well, they do have a case. Why do they have a case? Because they're actually sticking to the Hebrew,
what we call Te'amei HaMikra, which is
cantillation. In other words, there sometime in about the 6th or 7th century, maybe a little later, maybe a little bit before, but you have the scribes, the Masoretic scribes, that added punctuation to the text.
According to a certain tradition of reading the text.
According to a certain translation.
Yeah.
And according to their punctuation, the Chabad translation actually follows this punctuation. So in that sense, we can say this is a correct translation of the Masoretic text.
Nevertheless, our response is
that all the names must belong to the child according to both biblical Hebrew syntax and the context.
Now, why would you say that? So where was Chabad wrong?
Okay. Basically, Chabad's translation and the Masoretic pointing, or the Masoretic punctuation of this passage, ignores all the rules of biblical Hebrew syntax, and it actually ignores the context. So for instance, the syntax, okay? Again, we're going to be a little bit technical, but it's important for our listeners to understand that typically this passage is refuted on the basis of biblical Hebrew, but actually the biblical Hebrew supports our case. We're saying that all the names here have to belong to the child. Why? Because every other instance that the verb kara, to call, appears in the kal stem, it's a specific stem of the Hebrew verb, followed by the word name,
Shem,
right, plus a pronominal suffix like his name, her name, their name, and then immediately after that, a proper name. The proper name always is the object and never the subject of the clause. We've given a lot of verses here. There are many cases.
So what Chabad is doing is a precedent that doesn't exist anywhere in the Hebrew Bible.
As is the Masoretic text, the cantillation, the punctuation. They're doing something that is not found anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. And in fact, the verb "and he called," right? Vayikra, and he called, okay? one of the arguments is, you see, you have a verb without a definite subject,
Yes.
and therefore God.
It has to be God.
It has to be God that's the subject, but that's simply not true, because in biblical Hebrew, you have this whole construction that's called an indefinite personal subject. It's very common. So for instance, Genesis 25, verse 26, so they named him Jacob. The word there is vayikra. He will call his name Jacob. But to translate this, it's, and they named him. It's his name.
Exactly.
He was named Zerah, Genesis 38, verse 30. And so the bottom line is, in order to make God, in order to attribute the first three names to God in this verse, is to violate everything we know about syntax.
And make a precedent that doesn't appear anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible.
Which looks very suspicious, if you ask me,
No,
right?
but that's not the only thing. What about the context itself?
The context, once again, if you're going to try to argue that for whatever reason, Isaiah gives three of these names to God, and then only one of the names to the child, it completely ignores the context, because in chapters 7 and 8, in all the other references to a child or names, it's the child whose names are significant. Not
He's the recipient of the names.
He's the recipient of the names. And so, for instance, in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, the name of the child is Emmanuel, right? In Isaiah chapter 8, verse 3, the longest name in the Hebrew Bible, Maher Shalal Hashbaz, it's the name of the child. And so what we see in the context is there's a focus specifically on the names of children. So to argue that the divine names belong to God and not to the child is basically to go against the syntax and the context.
And it seems like Chabad also went against other ancient Jewish interpretation.
Correct. So what we see in the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin, chapter 94, verse section A, they argue that the 8 names of Hezekiah are written, and they give the names. For us, a child is born, a son is given, and his name is Peleoetz, right?
So
Wonderful Counselor.
they attribute the name to Hezekiah, but what's important, that they give the 4 names to Hezekiah.
Correct.
They
Because
don't give none of the names to God himself.
why? Because they're reading biblical Hebrew correctly.
And we have another example from Otzar Midrashim, another ancient midrash, rabbinic midrash.
And here they argue that these names specifically belong to the Messiah.
Which names?
Okay, so you have Inon from Psalm 72, Tzemach from Zechariah 6, Messiah, Daniel 9.
And then?
And then Peleoetz, which is Wonderful Counselor, El Gibor, Mighty God, Aviad, Eternal Father, Sal Shalom, Prince of Peace. And so they're saying that all of these names are the names of the Messiah. Once again, what we see, nobody can accuse the people that, nobody can accuse the people that wrote this Midrash or Sanhedrin that they don't know biblical Hebrew, or that they don't know Hebrew.
Of course not.
Okay.
Yeah. And the other thing, so if so, why is there a problem with that verse attributing these names to God?
Okay. Attributing the names to the child.
Or to the child, exactly.
Correct.
Attributing the names that appear to be godly names to the child. What's the problem?
Okay, so what we can already see, even when the Septuagint was made, or the Old Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, okay, what's really interesting is even before the time of Jesus, that you could see that the translators were very uncomfortable with calling the child El Gibor, mighty God. And so what the Greek translation does is it switches the name from El Gibor to Gavriel. In other words, it doesn't use the word Gavriel, but Gavriel is an angel.
Yep.
And so the Greek translation says, and his name is called the messenger of the great council. In other words, for whatever reason, this verse for Jewish people, even before the time of Jesus, was very uncomfortable. How can we call a child the mighty God? And in fact, there's no other verse, there's no other name in the Hebrew Bible where the first name of the child is El.
Yes.
That name can end a name.
Like Ishmael.
Right, but not as the beginning of a name.
Yeah, that's too strong.
Targum Yonatan, which is an Aramaic translation of the same verse, also, they were very uncomfortable, incredibly uncomfortable with calling this child by that specific divine name. And so what did they do? They basically give these names to God himself, and they only attribute the Prince of Peace to the Messiah.
Yep.
Okay? Chabad, as we saw, Chabad really does not want to allow the child to be called Mighty God, even though the Hebrew is clear. the child is called Mighty God.
So actually, they're making our case. They're making our life easier because they're saying it is a name that belongs only to God.
And we agree.
Exactly.
Right? So by virtue of the fact that they're so uncomfortable with this name, the reason they're uncomfortable is because this is a name that belongs to God, and it's inappropriate to call a child Mighty God unless we're dealing with a divine Messiah.
And you also mentioned Isaiah 10:21.
Correct.
Which
the
repeats,
word Mighty God appears again. And what's interesting, in 10:21, the Septuagint, or the Greek translation, actually there translates the name literally from the Hebrew, but they refuse to in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 5. And so it says, only a remnant shall return, only a remnant of Jacob to Mighty God. And so Mighty God in the context is referring to God himself.
Of course, it has to be
and
God.
So these ancient interpreters, these ancient translators, they struggled, and for good reason, because it's a verse that attributes deity or a divine name to this Davidic son.
So does the Hebrew Bible mention a divine Messiah anywhere else?
Yeah, so obviously Isaiah 9:5 would be one of those cases, but Daniel 7:14, we did in another podcast where we talked about one like a son of man, and the way that the one like a son of man is described in the context of Daniel, in the book of Daniel, he's a divine Messiah. Psalm 45, we'll do a podcast on Psalm 45 at some point. One of the most clearest attributions of deity to the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible. And so the notion of a divine Messiah, as uncomfortable as it might feel within the context of Judaism, particularly because of the New Testament, particularly because the New Testament attributes deity to Yeshua, the Messiah. And so, again, by virtue of the fact that the Jewish translators, the Jewish interpreters were so uncomfortable with calling this child Mighty God, shows
it strengthens our point.
It strengthens our case that what we have here is a passage and a reference to a divine Messiah.
So let's go to objection number 3, that the passage refers to Hezekiah and not to the Messiah. And they say anyway it refers to Hezekiah. So what's all the talk about Messiah?
And let's just look there objectively at the evidence, because I would argue that they actually have a really good case.
So a close reading of the passage strengthens their case.
Yeah, so let's look. So for instance, if you look at in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 23 and 9:3, and again, the verses may be off. I don't remember if we're using the Hebrew or the English references, but you've got this reference to Zebulun and Naphtali, and then it says that there's going to be this major victory in 9:3, as in the day of Midian, like this victory over the enemy, okay? In Judges 8:10, this refers to the victory of Gideon, right? In Judges 8, verse 10, where you have a reference to Zebulun and Naphtali, and in that day, Midian, there were 120,000 fighting men that were destroyed. And so this passage about this child and the victory he will bring is compared to the day of Midian. And lo and behold, when you see Hezekiah, who trusted the Lord in chapters 36 through 38, okay, we see that God intervenes when Jerusalem is surrounded, and in one day 185,000 soldiers, Assyrian soldiers, fall. And so this seems as though this is a reference to Hezekiah.
Exactly.
And there's more. Okay, in Isaiah 9, verse 3, you have a reference to the yoke that they're borne on their back, a rod. Okay, in 10:27, you've got the same language about this burden on the back, a yoke. 10:27 seemingly refers to the Assyrians, okay? And then in Isaiah 14, verse 25, it's absolutely clear: to break Assyria in my land, to crush him on my mountain, and his yoke shall drop off them, and his burden shall drop from their backs. The same language. So this seems to be a reference to
Hezekiah,
to the days of Hezekiah. Okay? Assyria in chapter 10, verses 5 and 15 is also called the rod of God's anger. Now, in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 4, you have a reference to the boots and the garments of the soldiers that will be burnt up and devoured after this victory. Well, that would make sense in Isaiah 37, verse 36. After God destroys 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, what are you going to do with their uniforms and their boots? You're going to burn them up. So it seems as though this really is about Hezekiah.
Hezekiah, yes.
Correct? There's more, okay? In Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, it says that the zeal of the Lord of hosts shall bring this to pass, with a reference to King David. And that phrase is found exactly in 37, verse 32 and 35.
Yep.
The zeal of the Lord of hosts shall bring this to pass, and I will do this for the sake of my servant David. So far the evidence seems to be very strong that Isaiah 9 is describing Hezekiah. There's more evidence.
Even more.
We're trying to be fair here,
Yeah.
right? And so in Isaiah chapter 10, Isaiah describes the boasting of this king in chapter 10, where he taunts, against Hamath and Arpad and Samaria, and references Jerusalem and the idols of Samaria. Well, when Rav Shakeh comes to Jerusalem as an ambassador, as a messenger of King Sennacherib of the Assyrians, he also starts to boast and taunt, and he speaks about Hamath and Arpad and the gods of Samaria.
In
And
a similar language.
It's similar language. So it seems as though Isaiah 9 and Isaiah 10 are referring to things that happen later on in Isaiah 36, 37, and 38.
And we have even more evidence to support that.
Again, Isaiah 10, verse 8 and 11, we talked about, Hamath, Arpad, the images, the idols. And again, in Isaiah 37, verses 11 and 13, the king of Assyria, through Rav Shakeh, his messenger, he says, where are the gods that saved you? Where are the gods of Hamath? Where are the gods of Arpad? And so all this looks as though this passage
Really talks about Hezekiah.
really is speaking about Hezekiah.
So what is our response? If a close reading is alluding to Hezekiah or is referring to Hezekiah, what's our response then?
Yeah. What we see here, I don't know when you were a kid. I used to love wearing my dad's shoes.
I was never a kid.
You were never a kid. But when I was a kid, 1,000 years ago, I used to love walking in my dad's shoes. But they're always too big for my feet. And so even though this is a close reading, it's not a close enough reading, because it's clear that the passage, the way that it's describing this child and the rule of this child, the shoes are way too big for Hezekiah's feet.
And it seems that the sages did a pretty close reading and they got something right concerning exactly what you said.
Correct. And so maybe I'll read this. It's a longer quote, but notice what it says in the
From
Babylonian
the Talmud
Talmud
Sanhedrin.
Apropos, right? Appropriate Hezekiah. The Gemara cites that which is stated, that the government may be increased, lamarbe, and of peace there shall be no end, and upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it through justice and through righteousness from now and forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts does perform this. So that's a quote of Isaiah 6:9, or 9:6, sorry.
9:6.
Rabbi Tanhum says that Bar Kapara taught in Sipori, due to what reason is it that every letter mem in the middle of a word is open, and this mem of the word lemarbe is closed? Again, there's a mem here, a Hebrew letter that's actually closed rather than open.
Yep.
In the Masoretic text, the letter mem in the word lemarbe is written in the form of a mem that appears at the end of a word, closed on all four sides. This is because the Holy One, blessed be He, sought to designate King Hezekiah as the Messiah, and to designate Sennacherib and Assyria, respectively, as Gog and Magog. All from the prophecy of Ezekiel with regard to the end of days, Ezekiel 38, and the confrontation between them would culminate in the final redemption. The attribute of justice said before the Holy One, blessed be He, Master of the universe. And if with regard to David, king of Israel, who recited several songs and praises before you, you did not designate him as the Messiah, then with regard to Hezekiah, for whom you performed all these miracles, delivering him from Sennacherib and healing his illness, he did not recite praise before you. Will you designate him as the Messiah? It is for that reason that the same mem was closed, because there was an opportunity for redemption that was thwarted. This is a long quote.
Yeah, but in other words, Hezekiah had the opportunity, but he missed it. He didn't fulfill it.
He failed, and so God did not set up the Davidic kingdom forever, which was the purpose of this verse and the purpose of this child.
And by the way, they say that he didn't recite praise before you, and we said in another podcast that reciting praise means the Holy Spirit is on you when you're reciting
Yes.
praise. And Hezekiah didn't do it. That's why he couldn't be the Messiah.
Correct. Also, if you actually look at the names of this child, so for instance, one of the names of the child is Counselor, or Wonderful Counselor, Pele Yoetz. He's also Mighty God, El Gibor, right? He's going to establish justice, mishpat, and righteousness, tzedakah. Well, this is the very language that's applied to the child in Isaiah chapter 11. And in Isaiah 11, after the destruction of what seems to be Assyria, right? There's no question that we're dealing with the Messiah.
Everybody agrees that that's a messianic,
And we see that the spirit of counsel will rest upon him, Eitzah, and strength, Gvorah, right? He will not judge, Yishpot, but with righteousness, but Tzedek. He will judge, Shaphat, also righteousness, Tzedek. In other words, if we're looking at the larger context, there's a direct connection between this child and the reign of this child, the future reign of the child, and the person, the Messiah in Isaiah chapter 11.
King Hezekiah doesn't measure up to the names that the text actually gives.
Absolutely doesn't measure up to the names. And in fact, once again, if you notice, there's an emphasis on the fact that this, the name Eternal Father, Ad, Avi Ad, okay, and Prince of Peace, Shalom. And then it talks about his government, that there's no end.
No end.
From then on and forevermore. Well, this whole notion of eternal peace or forever peace sounds an awful lot like the larger context.
Exactly.
Let me just stop and say, if we want to look at the context of Isaiah 9, you have to set it in the context of Isaiah 1 through 12, which scholars agree is a unit. Chapter 1 introduces the entire book of Isaiah. Chapter 2 through chapter 12 are like an envelope. And what's interesting is chapter 2 talks about this future and the last days. Chapter 11 and 12, the last days. So everything in between is framed by eschatology. And notice, the Prince of Peace is the name of the child. And in chapter 2, verse 4, they're hammering their swords and their into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. In chapter 11, you see that the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the young goat, and they will not hurt, they will not destroy in my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And so these names that are given to the child in Isaiah chapter 9 all refer to things that are supposed to happen in Isaiah chapter 2 in the last days, and in Isaiah chapter 11 with the days of the Messiah.
Yep, and did not happen with Hezekiah. But not only that, Hezekiah doesn't measure up even in the immediate context, right?
Correct. And so again, if you look at Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2, Isaiah 2 through 4, Isaiah 11, 3 through 9, again, without going into it, if you look at the description of the Messianic days, Isaiah 2, Isaiah 11, and then you start to look at the description of what this child is supposed to do in Isaiah 9, it cannot be Hezekiah. It just simply can't be.
It's exactly like the Talmud says. He didn't measure up. He didn't fulfill what was spoken.
Correct.
Yes.
Not to mention, Isaiah 39 is a very important chapter in the book. It ends the first half of the book, and in Isaiah 39, without going too much into detail, we see that Hezekiah actually failed.
Yep.
He showed his treasures and everything in his house to the king of Babylon, or to the envoys from Babylon. And as a result, God says, your sons are going to end up in Babylon.
Yep.
So by virtue of the fact that his sons were going to go into exile means that all these promises to the house of David, all these promises to this child were not fulfilled in Hezekiah.
And not only that, we see that Hezekiah didn't even measure up to the inner biblical evidence themselves.
Okay, again, if you look at Isaiah chapter 9, verses 5 and 6, you have reference to a son. Okay, you have reference to a kingdom that will be established forevermore.
Yep.
You have reference to a throne. Now, all these words are what you would call key words that appear specifically in God's promise to the house of David. 1 Chronicles 17, 11 through 14. When your days are fulfilled that you must go to be with your fathers, that I will set up one of your descendants after you, who will be of your sons, and I will establish his kingdom. And he shall build for me a house, and I will establish his throne forever. And I will be his father, and he shall be my son. And what's interesting is Isaiah 9, 5, and 6, it hits on all of these phrases from God's promise to the house of David.
There's a common language.
Yes, but we know that even in the post-exilic period, so for instance, in Zechariah 9, 9 through 10, you have a reference to the Davidic Messiah in the future. In other words, even the post-exilic prophets understood that the promise to David had not yet been fulfilled. And that means that Isaiah 9 also could not have been fulfilled by Hezekiah.
Exactly. And we have support for that from the Talmud itself, because it seems like Rabbi Hillel made a mistake and somebody had to rebuke him.
Correct. So let's read it. In Sanhedrin 99a, Rabbi Hillel says, there is no Messiah coming for the Jewish people, as they already ate from him, and all the prophecies relating to the Messiah were already fulfilled during the days of Hezekiah. Rav Yosef says, may the master forgive Rabbi Hillel for stating matters with no basis. With regard to Hezekiah, when was his reign? It was during the first temple period, where Zechariah ben Berechiah, the prophet, prophesied during the second temple period and said, rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king will come to you. He is just and victorious, lowly, and riding upon a donkey, and upon a colt, the foal of a donkey. In the generations of Hezekiah, there are prophecies about both redemption and the coming of the Messiah. And so they see in Hezekiah a picture of the Messiah, but based on the fact that the prophets after the exile, the return,
still expecting a Messiah.
They were still expecting the promises to the house of David to be fulfilled. And therefore, this cannot be about Hezekiah.
So there's an Israeli Bible scholar that even says that the sages themselves saw Hezekiah as a prototype, as a messianic prototype.
Yes. So by virtue of the fact that you see overlap between Hezekiah and the description of this child in chapter, I would say in chapter 7, in the Emmanuel prophecy, in chapter 9, and even in chapter 11, basically what Meir Givati says is that Hezekiah was this messianic, he was a figure. Hezekiah was a figure of the coming Messiah, whose life and deeds point beyond himself to someone far greater. And so in that sense, the sages were reading Hezekiah much like the writer of Hebrews was reading the law. As signs of something greater.
As a shadow.
Correct, as a shadow. So like Yeshua, Hezekiah was also surrounded by enemies and mocked for trusting in the Lord, just like Jesus at the cross. Like Yeshua, Hezekiah was actually delivered from certain death. He was going to die, and in some way, figuratively, God raised Hezekiah from the dead.
Exactly.
Literally, God raised Jesus from the dead.
But unlike Hezekiah,
all the other Davidic kings, Jesus alone, he embodies the fullest measure of the meaning of every name. To call Yeshua mighty God, to call Yeshua Pele Yoetz, right? The wonderful counselor is fully consistent with his nature.
Amen, amen. So let's go to the fourth and last objection, that Isaiah, these verses from Isaiah, and in the English it's 6:7, never quoted in the New Testament. So what's all the fuss? Well, what are you doing a big deal of that? How come the New Testament didn't quote it?
Yeah, so the argument is, if this passage was about Jesus, why didn't the New Testament quote it? So I'll let you give the response. What's the response?
No, be'emet. Come on.
No, be'emet. Nu be'emet in Hebrew means
come on,
guys.
Are you kidding me?
Or we could say not, right?
So Isaiah 9 is in fact quoted.
Yes, it is. And so in Matthew 4, 12 through 16, we read, now when Jesus heard that John had been taken into custody, he withdrew into Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he came and settled in Capernaum, which is by the sea in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. This was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who were sitting in darkness saw a great light, and those who were sitting in the land and the shadow of death, upon them a light dawned. it's clear.
Matthew is quoting the headline of the chapter.
Correct,
The
which they
first
do,
verse.
which they do all the time. Okay,
If they want to refer to a passage, they refer to the headline, and then you know, like in Psalm 22.
My God, why have you forsaken me? So the great scholar Richard Hayes uses the phrase metalepsis. It's kind of a complicated word, but all it means is that many times when you have like a citation of a couple of words from the passage, basically the author intends for the reader to bring into it the entire context of the original citation. And
Exactly.
so it's clear that the New Testament does refer to this passage and that they do understand this child to be Jesus.
Amen, amen. So let's do a brief summary of the four objections and the responses that we gave. So the first one was?
Yeah, so although, yes, the verbs appear to be in the past tense, that's a pretense. It's not a good argument because the promise of Isaiah 9 in the context looks ahead to the future.
And we saw even in verse 7 in the English, it says ta'aseh.
The zeal of the Lord will accomplish this.
Anyway, the second one?
The second argument, or the second summary of the argument and the response, although some claim that the divine names don't belong to God, the syntax and context make clear that all the names have to belong to God. And the rabbinic and the Jewish sages agreed with that.
Yeah, and what about Hezekiah?
Yeah, third, although the passage, it does allude to Hezekiah. It alludes to him. But Hezekiah in the book of Isaiah serves as a symbol for the coming Messiah in the book of Isaiah as the sages understood.
Exactly. We saw that the sages themselves saw it.
And then finally, the argument that, this can't be about Jesus because the New Testament doesn't quote it, that's not a really strong argument. Although some claim it was never cited, the fact of the matter is Matthew absolutely assumes these verses refer to Jesus. And so again, hopefully this podcast was a blessing. We want to challenge you to check what we've said, to read carefully and see. And we believe that these verses really do refer to Yeshua the Messiah. Verse 5 or verse 6 in the English, all the divine names belong to Yeshua. Verse 6 in the Hebrew, verse 7 in the English, one day our Messiah is returning. Yeshua will come again and he will reign forever and ever.
Amen.
If this touched your heart,
Wow,
will you help pay it forward to reach others who need to hear this message? Partner with our team to bring the gospel to Israel and the nations.